Welcome, everyone. This is the Liberty Classroom course, History of Economic Thought 1, Classical Economics and the Marginal Revolution. I'm your instructor, Robert Murphy. We are now on Lecture 13, John Stuart Mill. Lots of information to cover in this lecture. John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873. Some biographical remarks. Born in London, John Stuart was the son of James Mill, whom we've covered in a previous lecture. And as I mentioned at that time, James Mill had a very elaborate, well-thought-out plan for what we would nowadays call homeschooling his son, John Stuart. John Stuart, by all accounts, was a child prodigy. He was learning Greek at age 3, Latin at age 8, knew the classics of philosophy and literature, and knew a bunch of math at very precocious ages. And however, perhaps because of that rigorous upbringing and the expectations that others had on him, around age 20, and we know this from his own explanation in his autobiography, around age 20, John Stuart Mill became suicidally depressed, just wondering what's the point of continuing. I'm paraphrasing, but he was unhappy and then had thought, well, what would it cheer me up? Suppose all of these things that my father and David Ricardo and Jeremy Bentham have been pushing for, suppose all that came to fruition and I saw the accomplishment of all these reforms that we've been pushing for, things we think are going to make the human race better or happier. Would that make me happy? And he realized, no, it wouldn't. All right, so then he was extremely depressed, realizing that I don't even see a light at the end of the tunnel here. And he says that just reading the poetry of Wordsworth is ultimately what pulled him out of that funk. And he also fell in love with Harriet Taylor, whom he would later marry. But at the time when he fell in love with her, she was married to somebody else. And he was a much older man. And the few accounts that I've read say we have no reason to suppose they did anything, beyond being platonic friends, that John Stuart Mill waited and then the other guy died and then he married Harriet Taylor. Some of John Stuart Mill's major works, and I stress the some because I had to just look at the list of his output and just pick some of the ones that jumped out that I thought were most appropriate for you guys. So, Essays on Some Unsettled Questions of Political Economy, that's 1844. Later in this lecture, we're going to talk about some of his thoughts drawn from that. His big work in terms of economics, The Principles of Political Economy, which is 1848. On Liberty, 1859, Utilitarianism, 1863, Auguste Comte and Positivism, 1865, and The Subjection of Women, 1869, that last one being a famous essay where he laments the fate of women, and even at that point, which was fairly civil in British society, saying that we need to strive more for equal treatment of women. Okay, let me just spend a minute talking about John Stuart Mill's place in the history of ideas, not just in terms of his economic contributions. So what you should know is that his Principles book was the best-selling economics book for 40-some years, only to be displaced later by Alfred Marshall's book. And John Stuart Mill's Principles, it epitomized British classical economic thought, stating Ricardo's system much more clearly than Ricardo himself had done, but it went beyond that. He dealt with some of the problems in the system that Ricardo had laid out, and then also Mill interjected his own innovations, and he wrote in such a smooth, seamless style that the average reader might not realize, oh, wait a minute, this isn't just Mill expertly systematizing what other people had done. This is Mill's own contribution. Mill was a hero of liberalism, so his book On Liberty was the defining treatment among what we might call classical liberals, and his book on utilitarianism, again, that was the gold standard, if you will, in that tradition. And his views were also quite, quote, liberal for the time. So let me just spend a minute, if you've never read it. So On Liberty, Mill is, again, he's a champion of liberty. That's what he would have thought what he was doing in his life's work not just his technical work on economics, but just in general, that he was liberating people. And you can see how he would have thought, his writings about women too would all fall into that. And for example, but also he was influenced very heavily by Bentham. And of course, he wrote a whole book on utilitarianism too. So it was, Mill's defense of liberty was not the same kind of defense that somebody like Murray Rothbard or Ayn Rand would give. All right, so Mill was not trying to deduce these abstract principles in terms of property rights, or what does natural law have to say, or what can we use our reason to deduce about the just system of property rights, and then, okay, boom, once we got that, well, then it's unethical to violate those. No, that's not the way Mill proceeded. So, for example, in On Liberty, he'll have a discussion about why would it be wrong, why would I not want the government to suppress viewpoints that all respectable people think are abhorrent, right? And Mill doesn't talk about abstract rights to your property, and hey, if I own this pencil and this paper, well, then why can't I write down whatever subversive thoughts I want? That's not the angle he takes. Instead, what he stresses is that suppose we're wrong. Suppose we in the majority who hold views that we consider to be unshakable, that clearly our views on such and such are beyond reproach. Who could possibly doubt them? Nonetheless, we could be wrong, and so we don't want to handicap a critic who might come along and point out the mistake in our thinking. And so for Mill, that was a very powerful argument against suppressing dissident viewpoints, was because that's the only way, or not the only way, but that's the chief avenue by which we're going to realize if we're all mistaken on something. We're suffering from groupthink. All right, so you can see how that argument's certainly correct, but it's a different kind of argument from something that, say, like Murray Rothbard would give as to why would I not want the state to go around prohibiting the publication or dissemination of views that even I agree are terrible views. Okay, let me read Mark Blogg's description of John Stuart Mill. So this is from Blogg's, who's a historian of economic thought, his book, Great Economists Before Keynes. So this is just the opening paragraph of his treatment of John Stuart Mill. Throughout the last half of the 19th century, during almost the whole of the Victorian age, right up to the publication of Alfred Marshall's Principles, which was 1890, the Principles of Political Economy, with some of their applications to social philosophy, which was 1848, by John Stuart Mill, was the leading economic textbook of the English-speaking world. It drew its enormous appeal from its extensive coverage of contemporary economic issues, from its judicious blending of economic analysis and historical illustrations, from its masterful synthesis of Ricardian doctrine with many of the qualifications introduced by Ricardo's critics, from its radical tone contained within an orthodox framework, from its elegant style, and from the reputation of Mill as a logician, philosopher, political theorist, and belles lettrist. And there, that's a French phrase. What he's saying is Mill wasn't just good at producing content, but he wrote with style. He was an elegant writer. Here was no mere economist, but a leading Benthamite, a, quote, saint of liberalism, and a figure that towered over the intellectuals of his time in almost every area of debate. Okay, so if the kid was a genius when he was 8 years old, reading Plato and stuff as a young boy, he went on to become one of the leading intellectuals of his day. So this is a good and it's bad, that if you like Mill, you think he's great, somebody like Murray Rothbard, just so you know, is aghast at this situation, because Mill was not at all hardcore, or Murray Rothbard would say consistent, in his views on laissez-faire and even on methodological debates within economic science proper. And so Rothbard doesn't like it when that happens, because then an interventionist or even a socialist could say truthfully, when they're in a debate with someone advocating laissez-faire, well, even John Stuart Mill concedes that, the market can't do such and such, and we need the government to come in, or there's a place for government in this area. And to be able to cite John Stuart Mill, who's held up as the epitome of British classical economic thought and the heir of Adam Smith and so on, it kind of undercuts the position of somebody who's trying to argue against the interventionists or the socialists on some issue. So, again, just to encapsulate that train of thought, Rothbard did not like John Stuart Mill's legacy because he thought Mill, though, a very obviously gifted person, a polymath, nonetheless was not the person to be carrying a torch for economic science. And again, I've said before, Rothbard thinks there's two trains of thought, and that he much prefers the tradition in economics coming from the French, and you could also say the Irish for Cantillon, as opposed to the English tradition. Okay, let me just spend a minute on this issue of socialism. So again, John Stuart Mill had been reared quite consciously by his father, who was a radical, to be a champion of limited government based on utilitarian principles. And so it was sort of ironic that the older he got, the more John Stuart Mill started playing footsie with other socialists and acknowledging various problems with the doctrines that he had received from his father and from Jeremy Bentham. And at one point, John Stuart Mill wrote words to the effect that, hey, there's different strands of socialist thought, and depending on which ones you're talking about, yeah, my wife and I, we would be socialists if that's what you mean by that term. So that's kind of a shocking thing for this hero of classical liberalism to be saying, when normally we think of it as the socialists and the classical liberals were at odds. I mean, you look at Bastiat, never tired of arguing with the socialists, and later Böhm-Bawerk would just be devastating in his critiques of Karl Marx. And yet John Stuart Mill had plenty of nice things to say about socialism. Now, to be fair, John Stuart Mill, to the extent that he was sympathetic to socialism, it was because he was for the individual and didn't like things, didn't like anything fettering the individual, whether it was an oppressive state or whether it was, social customs of the day that made you, bury your individuality and conform to opinion. So so when John Stuart Mill considered himself to be a liberal and to be for individual freedom and autonomy, he didn't merely mean, I don't want someone initiating force or fraud against me, the way a modern Rothbardian would mean that phrase. Instead, John Stuart Mill meant more, I don't want other wills sort of impeding my self-development or something, the flourishing of my creativity and individuality. And so in that respect, you could see how certain aspects of industrial society in Great Britain might turn him off, and he might be sympathetic to the socialist writers who were also against what they were calling the fruits of capitalism. Okay, so let's now focus on John Stuart Mill's innovations in economic thought. So this issue of rent as an opportunity cost of production, let me backtrack a little bit and give a bird's eye view of how Ricardo handled rent in his framework, and then with that as the default or the baseline, you can see what John Stuart Mill's tweaking of that was, or his disagreement with Ricardo. So in the basic Ricardian model, which we discussed in a previous lecture, the way it would work is that the population's growing, and so they have to keep producing more and more corn every period, because the population would grow to the point at which they would just get subsistence amounts per person. And so at any given time, if the population grows, they got to bring more land under cultivation. And so, of course, with every successive growth in the population and then bringing more land under cultivation, it's going to be less and less fertile land, meaning for a given acre and a certain amount of workers, you're going to get fewer bushels of corn. So what that meant was, on the margin in the Ricardian model, the market price of corn was determined in the long run by the cost of production of the workers needed to work that marginal plot of land. So the landlord, the owner of that marginal plot of land, didn't get Ricardian rent for it because the price of corn was just sufficient to pay the wages of the workers to produce that corn on that marginal plot of land. All right, so there was nothing left over for that particular landowner to be able to draw, to accrue as a rental payment for the use of his land, because the amount of corn that the workers would pull out of the ground was just sufficient to pay their wages so they wouldn't starve, so they would have enough energy and calories to perform that process again the next period. But what that meant was then the owners of all the infra-marginal land, so the land that was more fertile than that marginal piece, they all earned positive rent because the price of corn is the price of corn, right? A bushel of corn that makes it to the marketplace, people can't tell whether it was grown on really fertile land or whether it was grown on that marginal plot. Corn's corn. And so the price of corn was determined on that marginal plot. And so that means the owners of farmland that was more fertile, they were able to extract a positive rent every period because they're growing more bushels of corn per acre for a given number of workers, and they're selling the corn for the same price, and they're paying the workers the same wages, right? Because the workers are interchangeable. They can work on different plots of land, so they all get paid the same amount per unit time of their labor. All right, so I hope you're seeing how that works. So in the Ricardian system, then it's definitely a cost of production theory and ultimately a labor theory of value in terms of the determination of market prices of corn. But you can see how the rent that the landowners earned, that seemed like it was a qualitatively different thing from the workers' wages and the price of the corn. Right? So because again, the workers kind of had to be paid enough to subsist or to subside. They had to be able to get enough in wages so they could go into the marketplace and buy enough food so they could survive. Because if they didn't get paid enough, then they would die. And well, okay, that's not a stable equilibrium. Supply of labor is going to shrink and wages would adjust. All right, so in the same also too, if they got paid more, well then they would just have more babies, and so you had that Malthusian idea going on. And the corn again was ultimately, its price was set by the cost of production of making that, deriving corn from those bushels of corn from the marginal plot of land. All right, so you can see those ideas at play, but then when it came to determining how much rent does the landlord get, it was a completely different mode of argument. It was you first pin down wages and the market price of corn, of the product, and then whatever the difference is based on the fertility of your land, that's what you as the landlord would get to keep. That's the income you would earn per period. It's like the amount of corn, the bushels of corn you would skim off the top, if you will. All right, so totally different framework. In contrast to that, John Stuart Mill realized that, well, hang on, let's say we're looking at a certain plot of land, and suppose it has more than one use. Suppose, yeah, you could devote it to agriculture and grow corn, but maybe you could do something else with it. Like, this is me talking, not John Stuart Mill. Maybe you could build a apartment complex on it and rent it out and have workers staying there and paying you rental payments to stay there, and that's where they live. Or maybe some merchants need to have a storefront, and so they pay you to erect it there, and that's where they sell their wares. And of course, they're going to pay you as the landlord for the use of your land. You're not just going to give that to them for free. So Mill realized that if you have other uses for your land, well, then the amount you could charge other people for that's a cost that is going to enter into the calculations. And so we would call it an opportunity cost. And so that, in a sense, is a cost of production that has to be factored into the calculations. All right. And so what Mill was groping towards there, was moving closer to, was treating the income that the landlords earned, the rental payments they got for the use of their land, treating it more closely or more symmetrically to the wages that the workers earned than Ricardo had done. All right, so it's still a cost of production theory of value. It's not going to be until we get to Menger and Jevons and Welross that we go towards a subjective margin of utility approach to market prices. But I'm saying the Ricardian system, it had several things wrong with it from our perspective. That it not only was it a cost of production theory, but it also treated the income that landlords earned on farmland, it treated that as a totally different kind of thing from what workers got as wages. And at least John Stuart Mill realized, wait a minute, the fact that we're going to start talking about costs of production and how those must be covered in long run equilibrium by the final price of the product that we're making, land is involved in there too. It's not that it's just the cost of paying the workers. It's also the implicit amount that if I could use this land in another process, well, then that's part of the cost of production. So the price of the corn that I'm selling in the market had better be high enough to cover not just the wages I got to pay the workers, but also I got to compensate for the fact that I could have been using this land, renting it out for another purpose and getting that rental payment. So if instead I'm going to be devoting it to producing corn, well, I better be earning at least as much from that line as from the other possible use. All right. So again, it was still a flawed cost of production theory, but at least he was being more consistent. Okay, let me just spend a minute on this idea of joint products. So another innovation is John Stuart Mill recognized that the approach of Adam Smith through Ricardo and using labor hours or sometimes cost of production to explain final product prices, and again, we're going to talk more about this when we get to the marginal revolution, but again, the idea is, well, how much does something sell in the marketplace for? If one item, if a stagecoach has 10 times the market value as a saddle, and Adam Smith up through Ricardo, when they're trying to explain that, would ultimately, use analyses or logic that would involve little thought experiments saying, well, how many labor hours went into each one? And so if 10 times as much labor went into the stagecoach, well, then you'd say, well, it's got to sell for 10 times as much because you need to make enough to be able to pay the cost of production. Okay, so that was the way the British classical economists would explain long-run, what we may call like natural prices or equilibrium prices in the long run. But John Stuart Mill recognized that standard approach hits difficulties if you're talking about a process that yields joint products. So, for example, if process A takes 100 hours of labor and produces 100 pounds of bacon, then sure, it makes sense to say, okay, so a pound of bacon trades for 1 hour of wages. But, that would be the standard approach of Smith on down. But then John Stuart Mill says, okay, but what if process B takes 100 hours of labor and what the product is, it's not just some number of units of something else, but it's 10 pounds of beef and simultaneously 20 gallons of cow's milk. All right, so it's 100 hours of labor, so you can still say, all right, so the products collectively must have a market price equal to 100 times whatever the wage rate is, because by assumption it takes 100 hours to produce those things. But all you really know is, okay, the market price of 10 pounds of beef plus the market price of 20 gallons of cow's milk must equal how much 100 hours of wages are, but you wouldn't be able to pin down, okay, but what's a pound of beef and what's a gallon of milk, just from that line of reasoning. All right, so John Stuart Mill made some headway on that problem and at least pointed out that was a problem with the conventional approach. Okay, he also talked about economies of scale in the firm. So he was one of the first to try to explain why do firms exist. And his answer was, or part of his answer was that they have internal economies of scale. All right, so a lot of people will say that Ronald Coase in the 30s was the first economist to really offer a theory of why the firm exists, or why does a firm have the size that it does, and his answer had to do with transaction costs, that it just to bring certain operations and exchanges within the boundaries of a given firm makes more sense, reduces transaction costs rather than just having every single transaction be conducted between different parties in an open market. And so it's not correct if you think Ronald Coase was the first economist to ever think about that stuff. That although his answer was somewhat different, John Stuart Mill was talking about it way back then. Also, you should know that as much as we lament the dichotomy between the French and the English traditions, John Stuart Mill was the one who brought the term entrepreneur into usage among the English-speaking economists. Okay, he also, Austrians would appreciate, John Stuart Mill broke up the classical concept of profit into three components. One, a return for abstinence, right? So that, you might say, that was focusing on the time preference element, right? So the fact that if you are a capitalist and you advance funds into an enterprise, and then when all is said and done, you get more money out than you put into it, the classical economists would just call that profit. But now John Stuart Mill is breaking up that gross profit into three components. So again, the first component is a return you're earning for abstinence, the fact that you're willing to defer consumption, you're earning a return for that. Two, an indemnity for risk. Okay, so John Stuart Mill recognizing that when a capitalist invests funds in an operation, he might lose his money. So he's going to be paid, he's going to get more back than he put in, partly just as indemnification because of the fact that his money was at risk. He could have lost it, so he's going to have to get back more than he put in. Otherwise, it would be safer just to sit on it. And then number three, a remuneration for labor and skill required for, quote, superintendence. So this is sort of capturing the managerial skill. So John Stuart Mill recognizing that gross accounting profit actually can be broken down into at least three separate components. And so that's very, it's not identical, but it's similar to what even modern Austrians might talk about when they say the actual gross accounting profit can be broken down into various components. Okay, let me now just discuss some of the, quote, concessions that John Stuart Mill made. So on these, some economists would be mad at him for doing this. Other economists, especially more mainstream ones, think this is a sign of his intellectual honesty, that Mill, regardless of what he might have thought politically and what he wanted the answer to be, nonetheless had to admit, hey, in these situations, it's logically possible that. So be that as it may, let me just at least explain to you what these issues are. Okay, so I talked about this before in a previous lecture, but it's so important, let me just go ahead and say it again in slightly different words. And the issue is Say's law and how introducing the money commodity might affect the strength of it. So to review, James Mill, so John Stuart Mill's father, James Mill had loved Say's work, and he gave a very forceful defense of Say's law. And I don't think I put it in quite these words in the previous lecture on this, so let me make sure I say it now, because for some people it'll really click this way. That if you're first imagining just a barter economy, there's a certain way that you can think about Say's law where it obviously is true. So think of it this way. If you're in a situation of barter and someone's trying to sell his goods, if he does sell them, so he's supplying his goods, the only way that can happen in any given exchange, if you're supplying goods, you necessarily, in that same act, are at the same time demanding someone else's goods. All right, so if the baker wants to get shoes, and so he's supplying bread, he necessarily at that moment is demanding the shoes. And vice versa, if the cobbler accommodates him and sells his shoes, he can't but help demanding the bread from the baker, correct? Because it's in the same exact trade where the bread's exchanging for the shoes. So each person in the same transaction is necessarily a seller and a buyer if a transaction occurs at all. All right, and so that's the sense in which you can't have a general glut in a barter economy. That doesn't even make sense. So remember, this is a very strong position or strong claim. We're not merely saying, oh, prices would adjust to eliminate a glut. No, we're saying, I don't care what the exchange ratios are. I don't care how many loaves of bread trade for a pair of shoes. It cannot possibly be in an exchange between the baker and the shoe cobbler that both of them are trying to sell the other person more items than the other person wants to demand. That can't be true at the same time. It could be true of one or the other. It could be that the baker is trying to sell more loaves of bread than the cobbler wants to buy at a certain exchange ratio between bread and shoes. But it can't be the case that they both are trying to sell each other more units than the other wants to buy. And so, again, that's not merely a claim about exchange ratios equilibrating, okay? So, again, in barter, there's a certain elegance of Say's law where you really can see, oh, yeah, you ultimately, when you go into the market with your supply, that's the means by which you demand other people's stuff. And so you could loosely summarize that by saying supply creates its own demand if you wanted to. And you can see how there's no way we have to worry about a general glut. That just means we're all producing more and exchanging more. We all have a higher standard of living. Okay, so John Stuart Mill, when he weighs in on this controversy, thinks he's, again, not that he's undercutting Say or anybody or that he's saying his dad is an idiot, but he's just clarifying, saying, okay, even though it's airtight and logically necessary for a strong version of Say's law to be true in barter, when you introduce the use of money and you realize one of the commodities is the money good, well, then you could have it that everybody is trying to sell more of all the other goods, and the one thing that they're not trying to sell more units of is the money commodity. And so there's nothing logically impossible about what I just said. But yet, isn't that what we mean by a general glut? Because when people talk about there being a general glut, another way of describing that is to say there's a scarcity of money. So clearly, people worried about a general glut saying, oh, there was overproduction, or they might say there's underconsumption. People aren't spending enough. They don't mean there's a general glut that too many people are trying to unload money. No, it's the opposite. What they mean is the one thing people aren't trying to unload is money. And they're trying to unload every other commodity more than people on the other side of the transactions want to accept. Okay, so again, it's not undercutting the wisdom of what Say wrote, and it doesn't mean market economies are prone to crises. It's just a logical point to make sure you're understanding, okay, what is the argument you're making? Because if you think Say's law is necessarily true and you're relying on a conception of barter, then John Stuart Mill is saying, wait a minute, things are more complex. In a modern economy, we're not literally trading bread against shoes. The baker's selling his bread for money and then may take the money and go buy shoes with it, but he may not, right? So that's what money does. It allows us to separate our sales from our purchases or our supply from our demand. And so that we now, when we think about supplying commodities, what we really have in mind is selling them for money. And when we think about demanding commodities, what we really mean is taking money to go buy stuff. And so the barter connection where you think ultimately the baker, when he gets shoes, you think, oh, in the grand scheme of things, the way he got those shoes was he supplied bread to the community. Okay, sure, in the grand scheme of things and ultimately, but not literally in the moment. Literally in the moment, the way the baker got the shoes was he gave cash to the shoe seller. And so again, That just, you got to refine how you're thinking about it. And as I said, and I posted earlier for the lecture that covered James Mill, I have that reading from George Reisman, where you can see that. So George Reisman's a modern economist, studied under Mises, and he thinks that James Mill gave the best exposition of Say's law ever, and thinks John Stuart Mill retreated unnecessarily. Okay, let's talk a little bit about tariffs in terms of trade. So another one of these so-called concessions is that John Stuart Mill, even though he had been steeped in the free trade tradition of his father and peers, nonetheless conceded that, yes, theoretically it is possible. We can imagine a situation where a country could enact a tariff on foreign producers and their products, and that could end up enhancing the welfare of the domestic citizens. Okay, so that would show that free trade, if it's true, if that argument's valid, it would show that there was a flaw in the arguments of Adam Smith through David Ricardo, and that it's not necessarily true. It's not an airtight case that if you start out from a position of having a tariff barrier and then got rid of it, that your citizens would on average become wealthier or have a higher standard of living, because that was what Adam Smith through Ricardo were teaching. And so John Stuart Mill was conceding, well, no, we can imagine a situation where it might be otherwise. So to give you an idea of how that works, and this, in terms of modern economics, they would call this having an optimal tariff. And what the way it works is you can imagine a situation where a government could enact a tariff and they would alter what's called the terms of trade of its own people with the rest of the world. So very loosely, if your country's big such that the demand from your people could affect the world price, then it's kind of like by your government levying a tariff on imports of that product, you're artificially reducing the demand of your people for that, and so you might be able to get it on cheaper terms from the rest of the world. All right, so it's sort of like if all of your own citizens could agree, hey, everybody, let's all just really get stringent and be hard-nosed bargainers and agree that we're all going to spend, or we're all going to reduce our demand for this foreign product by a certain percentage, and then ultimately we'll still end up getting that product from them, but on much better terms, just because of the slope of the demand curves and elasticities and all that stuff. So you could theoretically imagine cases like that, in which case, if the government had all the right information and the right incentives and levied the tariff just right, it's possible that the standard of living of your citizens would go up. It wouldn't make the world better off, but you could imagine the people of the country levying the, quote, optimal tariff benefiting at the expense of the rest of the world. So I'm not saying it's a good idea. And even John Stuart Mill was still a free trader, right? So he wasn't saying, okay, so now I'm not sure whether I'm for tariffs or not. He was just saying, in the interest of intellectual honesty, I realize that, yes, there is a chink in the armor that we've inherited from Ricardo. Okay, and then the last thing I'll talk about is the so-called wage fund controversy. This is a little bit of inside baseball, but it's useful to get you to understand how the classical economists thought about these matters. So going back at least to Adam Smith, in the British classical tradition, there was this idea that the capitalists had a stockpile or a fund of already made consumption goods, and that this is what they would advance to workers for their wages. All right, so the workers would work on projects, and they would need to eat right away. All right, so if a farmer's coming to your field to plant crops, and they're going to work the land, and then when harvest time comes around, they're going to harvest the food. Well, on day one, you've got to pay the farmer's you got to pay the tenant farmers for their labor. Okay. And so the idea is they have to eat right then. They can't wait for the harvest to come. Otherwise, they'll starve to death. So there has to be, yes, in the real world, of course, you're paying them with money and then they go into the town and they buy food. But when you're stepping back and looking at the system as a whole and just thinking in terms of broad aggregates, what ultimately has to be happening is that there are property owners, wealthy people, who have a fund of ready-made goods, food and stuff you need to make a house or whatever, and clothes. And so the things that the workers are then buying with their wages, with their money wages, that stuff already had to be made. That was the result, the fruits of previous production processes, right? In general, when the worker goes and puts in a full day of labor, there's nothing tangible that's ready for consumption at the end of that one day's labor, or whatever the period is. If you work a week and then get paid for the week or what have you, a lot of that stuff, the worker is contributing to a long-term ongoing production process, and yet the worker needs to eat every day. He's got kids at home and stuff who need food right now. So the idea was that the capitalists would advance this food and other necessities to the workers in order to keep them going until then, the harvest was reaped from the production process, both literally in terms of agriculture, but also, if you were making a stagecoach or something, and that takes some time to develop before that thing pops out the end of the production pipeline. All right, so, and it was John Stuart Mill who, in his Principles book, dubbed this the wage fund. And so the way this was used is, obviously there's different nuances in the hands of different writers, but generally speaking, this was a good stick, if you will, with which to beat down proposals to radically transform the distribution system, right? To say that, oh, if only we had stronger unions, or only if we had socialism, or only if we had strict government reforms, surely the working man could have a much higher standard of living. We just give the working man more and give other people less. And so the idea was, well, wait a minute. There's really, if the workers are ultimately being advanced this wage fund that the capitalists have saved every period, and that's what keeps the workers physically alive until, the next harvest comes around, and then we replenish the wage fund, well, then there's really, I don't care what unions do, or I don't care what government laws get passed, or I don't care whether you seize the means of production and turn them over to the workers, the wage fund is what it is. And so the per capita, you might be able to make some workers get more, but then that means other workers have to get less, right? There's just the wage fund is what it is. That's what the capitalists are going to advance to the workers. And so there's only so much per head to go around until the next harvest comes in. All right, so that you can see how when you're thinking of it like that, it sort of makes it seem that, well, gee, just physically speaking, we can't alter how much the workers are going to get for an hour of work. So Mill caused somewhat of a shock in these circles when in 1869 he was in the process of reviewing somebody else's work, and so the person had been discussing this issue of the wage fund, and John Stuart Mill confessed that he had made a mistake in the earlier editions of his own book, of his own Principles book. And he said, okay, yep, now I realize that the size of the wage fund is more malleable than my earlier writings had realized, or that I had realized in my earlier writings. And so once we realize that there is some discretion in how much the capitalists save, and so how big that wage fund is out of which the workers' wages are advanced as they wait for, the fruits of their labor to be harvested down the road, we see that, okay, yeah, we could imagine certain reforms or changes in the rules of distribution to allow for permanently higher per capita living standards for the workers without changing the structure of our economic system or something. So what's interesting is Mill himself didn't think what he was doing was some huge revolutionary move. He was just saying, okay, yeah, I was a little bit too dogmatic, or I was not flexible enough in my earlier treatment of this, and now I realize it could be more. But he didn't like radically change the treatment in his book. But nonetheless, this was a controversy at the time because it looked like, oh my goodness, the guy who coined the phrase the wage fund and whose book is so authoritative, he's the epitome of British classical economics and the tradition going back to Adam Smith, and now he's admitting that he had been wrong about the wage fund doctrine, which orthodox conservative economists had been using to beat back the socialists and the reformers all this time. So you can see how that was kind of a PR disaster for the opponents of socialism. Okay, so we will stop there.